the Ross Art Museum at Ohio Wesleyan University in an exhibition called Paul-Henri Bourguignon, Recurring Themes. It's an exhibition that encompasses 4 decades of work by an artist who was born in Europe and spent the last years of his life in the United States. And I'm sitting here with his widow, Erika Bourguignon, and we're going to talk a little bit about his work. Can you begin by talking a little bit about Paul's background and how he got started as an artist?
Yes, Paul was born in Brussels in 1906 in Belgium, and he began as an artist, as an art student, an artist as a young man at probably about the age of 17. He worked with a teacher with whom he traveled across Belgium, particularly to the art cities like Bruges and Gand and so on, and he worked in pastel, but not in pastel as we think of it, as flowers and pretty children, but as a landscape painter, carrying his material along, and gaining a considerable amount of proficiency. And then he began to travel more widely, first to Paris and then the south of France, to what were then really exotic places like Corsica and Spain and
Bosnia.
Yugoslavia. Well, Bosnia, of course, was part of Yugoslavia, but also to Serbia. And he was very much impressed, particularly by going to a place like Yugoslavia where he could read the signs because he couldn't read Cyrillic alphabet, and he couldn't understand the language, and he thought that was absolutely wonderful, being in a strange, exotic place. But he had a very sobering experience, and that is that he, sitting on a terrace of a cafe in he got to talking with a young man of about the same age who knew some French and who said, how wonderful it must be to be in an exotic place like Brussels, not like what we have here, always the same thing. So there are, wherever you are at home, it may just seem too familiar and too dull, and places that are different suggest other opportunities, but they may not be quite as exotic to the people who live there.
But for the rest of his life, at least on and off, Paul seemed to really make an effort to plunge himself into other circumstances, other places, other environments. And after studying as an artist in Brussels and working in Belgium for a while, after the war, he spent time in Haiti, where you two met.
That's right.
And
That's right.
In Peru, and then ended up in Columbus, Ohio. And so this exhibition, although most of the works in it were done in Columbus, all of them were done in Columbus, they encompass his experiences and his memories and his thoughts of all of those places.
That's quite true. That's quite true. And I should add, of course, in addition to the visual experiences, there was his study of art history and his just study of literature. And Brussels is a city full of art. You don't have to particularly go to a museum. You don't even have to go into a church. You might just look at a church from the outside. And the place is full of history, full of art, and memories of famous artists, Virgil and so on. And that, I think, you will see all of that really reworked, reprocessed in what we have in this gallery.
And in fact, when we were thinking about the title of the show and the work for the show and the sort of the recurring themes of the show, one of them is about how Paul always drew on his experience, his education. We talked about one theme being sort of Paul as the observer and how his observation was always filtered through his travels, but also through his studies, his cultural awareness of the world as a whole.
That's right.
And we've got a perfect example that we're sitting right by, which is this triptych of donor figures with the image of the city of Toledo in France. And
in Spain.
In Spain, excuse me, gosh. Toledo, Spain. And Paul had written his dissertation on El Greco, who
correct.
did several very, very famous paintings of Toledo. And
one in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, of course.
And so this is, in a sense, building on that, but it also, to me, I look at it and I see Cézanne and Cézanne's admonition to artists to see the world in terms of cubes and squares, and there's a very sort of cubic or fauvist feel to the simplification of the landscape.
Yeah, I see a number of things here, or at least one thing beyond what you were saying, and that is the reflection of these houses in the waters of the river. Because I recall Paul telling me how he spent time in Bruges in Belgium, sitting at a canal, staring at the water and looking at the reflections in the water. So many, many years later, that scene of reflection in the water comes back. We might take a look at the other versions, the earlier versions of Toledo that act really as preparations for this. But in this case, you have it framed or linked to the image of donors, the King Ferdinand and Isabella in this case, with their prayer books, and in which there is actually a signature and the date in both of these cases. Now that, of course, is an allusion to altar pieces that you might see in churches in Belgium. There is one other point about this, or maybe a couple. One of them is that at least the heads of these figures are identical drawings, and they do not look at the center, which you would have in a church painting, but they look at the viewer and will follow you around. And one other little detail, and that is that the head is in fact a simplified self-portrait.
But they're essentially identical, the two, that he has then just used very, very subtle changes to suggest the female figure and the male figure.
That's correct.
Which is part of that sort of interest in the simplicity and sort of the essence of the image is also comes through in the way he's looking at the landscape, which is very much in the tradition of European modernism.
Whereas this has a sort of folk art scene, and if you look behind you then, this painting of he called Andean women, which comes from his experience in Peru, of course. This has some of the same tradition of the folk art.
Exactly, and when you look at this all together, and why I was saying I think this is such an example of all the fusions and synthesis that we are talking about, is that it's an image of a city in Spain, you know, that he would know not only through observation but through famous art, then fused with his memories of Bruges and the reflections of the water, his memories of Peru and the people of Peru and the folk art of Peru. So it's an old world scene, it's a new world scene, it's a scene that's based on memory and culture and education and observation all rolled up into one.
Absolutely.
And a little bit of a joke through all of that too, and I think that's sort of...
If you look at these two figures of the donors, they're really quite humorous. We once had a student living with us, and he discovered that there was a painting in his room and he came out in the morning very disturbed. He had thought that the painting was humorous, but he didn't know that art could be fun. And so he was wondering whether it was all right to laugh or whether he had missed something. And I think that's again says a lot.
I think that's actually, there are a lot of works in this show that make you smile or laugh on some level, partly just through Paul's delight in what he was doing.
Absolutely. Speaking of figures and humor, this is a pair of faces that are labeled or are identified as Don Quixote and Dulcinea, and that brings you a different sort of relationship than we saw among the donors, but it is again a relationship. He at least is very much interested in her, she is a little less interested, which reflects the storyline. So here you have the painter going back to Spain to rather simplified facial representations with an emphasis on eyes, among other things, and with a sense of humor and memory, in this case not of a scene but of a character in literature, which is entirely relevant again to Spain and Peru and simplification and whimsy and portraiture and all of these things. These are two very different paintings of Haiti. The first one is very much emphasizes bright colors and the structure that suggests Haiti most typically are these tall palm trees. It's sunlight that really bleaches out objects and reality and emphasizes color and movement. The other one is a bit more static, but you again have these very tall palm trees and a series of little houses and people. The Haitian landscapes very typically show people. Many of the other landscapes really don't. There are no people in the Toledo landscape. There are no people in the various studies of Toledo and so on. So the other interesting thing about this Haitian painting is the sky actually isn't bright blue. The blue is the sea behind it, but the sky is dark because of the way in which the sun shines intensely, whereas the roofs, which are sheet metal, reflect the sun. So that you have both reality and the emphasis on certain kinds of features of the landscape.
Sort of reality reduced to its essentials or concentrated in its essentials, which is something that we often talk about in Paul's really, really acute visual memory. And what he remembered was sort of the strongest sensations, the brilliant colors, the way the sun affected the colors, the way it reflected off those metal roofs.
This is a long way from Toledo and the Cézannean characteristic of landscape. And again, the start with a drawing and so on, but that you have an immediate reflection of the scene in his head on paper without really going through a process of setting up a design and so on.
We both have discovered that a lot of visitors to the show seem to gravitate towards this piece, which has the title The Last Canvas, and we've both been sort of wondering a little bit about why, and do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yes, it's a painting from the early 50s. It's a gouache, and it is a strikingly impressionistic kind of landscape, the rather classic theme of a large haystack. And then there's a little painter and his easel. He's even looking away from the easel. The interesting thing is that when the Impressionists began to paint this way, they were received with horror and shock. It was oversimplified, it wasn't refined enough, and so on. And that now, more than 100 years later, is seen as comfortable, familiar landscape art.
And Paul was actually maybe almost commenting a little bit on the Impressionists.
That's right,
in this painting.
This is the way he was trained, of course, in the 1920s.
To work outside.
To work outside, and he had a story of how he had painted a house that had white walls, and he thought yellow would look better. And his teacher was horrified. He had made a change in the landscape. He hadn't reflected it correctly. So he was, I think, commenting, rejecting as outmoded a particular way of working.
But the other thing that's kind of fun is the figure, again, just by capturing very, very simple, concise means, kind of an awkward pose in the painter.
That's right.
And I think it maybe captures both the sense of anticipation and anxiety that artists often feel when confronting both subjects and blank canvases.
Absolutely.
And I think that might also be sort of part of the joke that he's pointing out and the fun that he's having with the subject.
Yes, I think so. Paul painted a lot of heads and a lot of figures, but how he painted them really began to change over the years. And here you see a head of a young man, dated about 1980, but on top of the paint you have a white outline. But the white outline doesn't exactly follow the face. The white outline suggests a somewhat different face, so that if you look straight at it, you see a profile. If you look more carefully, you see a three-quarter. But if you move along, you will see that there are in fact two eyes and you have a full face. So you can make this head turn whichever way you as the viewer would like to. In the next painting, you actually have something even more strongly emphasizing the white lines, because you don't have a figure in the colors. The figure is entirely imposed by the white lines.
This is the first painting in the show, and it's one of many modernist interpretations of a woman with a rather interesting hat.
That's right, but it comes out of a European tradition. It's one of the early paintings that Paul did in Columbus. And as the years went by, his manner of approaching faces and figures changed. And you can see that as we move along here to a painting of just a few years later, which is considerably simplified and much emphasizes a different kind of expression on the face. And the third one here is something of a self-portrait, although not admitted as such, but again influenced very heavily by classic art.
Both classic art and modernist art, because you can see both sort of the El Grecos, but also the Picassos and Matisses and Modiglianis and the European modernists that Paul's studies would have been really steeped in.
That's absolutely correct. Now, as we then move again into a much more later period of his life, we find a totally different approach, and yet he never wanted to be an abstract artist. As you know, he talked about transposition, but that there was always a human experiential dimension to his work, and not simply an arrangement of forms. This is an acrylic on a paper, and it involves the use of a variety of tools, I would say. And you can see that there are layers upon layers of paint, and the figure is quite schematic, but it has the essence of Don Quixote. It has the spear and the wash basin that turns into a helmet, and the eye and the eagerness and so on, and the strength of, I'm tempted to say that the strength comes out of the colors, the red, the yellow that pierce the black, and so on. It is a very schematic, it's very dynamic, and it speaks to you really quite directly.
And the figure's very much emerging from the ground. You've told me before that in these later works, Paul used all kinds of different painting tools. He used sponges and spatulas and kitchen implements and printed on.
And very vigorous kind of painting.
And would lay in the ground of the painting and then let the figure, it's almost like he would discover what figure wanted to come out of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see that even more so in another one that we'll see right here. In this case, you have something he did actually quite often, and that is to cover an area with a pattern, and using bright colors and again various kinds of gadgets and so on, and then extracting this figure from the larger area by using a spatula, using in this case darker colors, but you can see that the pattern itself underlies this darker color. Pierces through. But what you end up with is a woman's head and bust and a rather long neck. But if it weren't hanging on a wall, if you didn't have a signature, you could turn it upside down and you'd have another lady. So in this case, this is part of her body, but you can imagine this is part of the head too. So that there is, as you said, a figure that wants to come out. You're reminded of Michelangelo's line about how the figure is in the marble and he removes the excess and the figure emerges. In this case, you have a large pattern, and there is in fact an embedded figure here if you look at it hard enough. But what is particularly interesting to me is something that I know he struggled with and talked about, and he really didn't talk much about his work, and that is that the light comes through from behind the painting. It isn't light coming from the front, but coming from the back, like as in a stained glass window in a church.
And that's actually something that you can see in a number of these later works, with the way the color is layered. It really is as if they're radiating out, and you can see them behind.
He actually labeled some of these more abstract seeming forms. He called it Japanese jugglers. And again, you see this pattern, and the dark background is in fact a foreground, right?
And the light comes through
and the light
behind
comes
to form the figures.
And you can see there are movements and the balls that they juggle and so on.
In a sense, the whimsy, his sort of appreciation of humor and whimsy comes that he would make a see what figures emerged, but then also sort of just see what they suggested to him, and then pull out that suggestion.
That's right. In other words, he didn't say, I will go and paint Japanese jugglers. But when he had it, he said, that's what they are.